Author Eileen Sheehan would like to share the first few chapters of her award-winning horror novel, Once Upon a Morgue.
From the author. Death is supposed to be the end. For some, it's only the beginning. Around the world, the handling of human remains exists in a shadowed space between law, tradition, science, and secrecy. While many people donate their bodies to advance medical education and research, not every donation ends where it is intended. In places where oversight is weak and greed flourishes, the dead can become commodities that are cataloged, transported, preserved, bought, and sold. Behind closed doors, a disturbing underground trade thrives. Families place their trust in professionals to care for their loved ones with dignity and respect, never imagining that human remains can disappear into black markets that are disguised as legitimate businesses. While illegal organ trafficking is widely feared, few realize that other body parts are also sold for profit, spectacle, and exploitation. But what if the dead are somehow aware of it all? Once Upon a Morgue by Eileen Sheehan is a chilling fictional thriller that explores the dark world surrounding death and the hidden industries that prey upon it. Blending suspense, psychological horror, and unsettling realism, the novel dives into misplaced trust, crimes concealed in silence, and the terrifying boundary between ethical practice and grotesque abuse. Enter carefully, because once read, it can never be unread. Chapter 1. Oliver Nettles died on a Tuesday, which the family later agreed was somehow fitting. He had always preferred weekdays for difficult matters, Tuesday for embalming, Wednesday for viewing, Thursday for burial, with hopes that the weather held. He disliked unnecessary delays, disliked fuss, disliked the kind of grief that turned into theater. When his own time came, he managed it the same way he had managed everything else in his life, quietly, with his affairs in order, and no one allowed to see the soft part of him. The morning of the funeral broke gray and wet over Nettle Hollow, with rain hanging in the air like a breath trapped in glass. The Nettles estate sat back from the road behind iron fencing and ancient live oaks. It was a wide space of land, setting at the edge of Nettle Hollow, which was just a hop, skip, and a jump from Manhattan, New York. The property was broken into 3 homes, and the old funeral parlor at the center of all. The main house where Oliver had lived for most of his widowhood was a large white Victorian with a window walk and a wraparound porch that never seemed to creak in the same place twice. The funeral parlor was on the main floor, with the mortuary in the basement of an addition in the back. To the east stood the smaller house where his eldest son and daughter-in-law had raised their daughter, and an almost identical house next to that where his daughter and her husband raised their 2 sons. Behind them was the carriage house turned guest cottage, where Oliver had once said a person could live in peace if they had any sense at all, and none of the family drama. It was in this little getaway that his granddaughter, Cindy Nettle, chose to reside. No one laughed when he said things like that now. The funeral home itself faced the graveyard side of the property, with its brick front plain and dignified, dark windows, and brass nameplate that read, Nettle Funeral Home and Mortuary Service, founded 1878. Oliver's grandfather had built it from a 1-room parlor and a second-hand hearse, back when the town still called him Mr. Nettles, like he might bless your hand if you asked politely enough. He had passed along the belief that one should take the work seriously in the way some men took religion. The dead, he said, deserved more attention than the living often gave them. They should be handled with skill, dressed with care, and laid out with enough dignity to keep the rest of the world from forgetting they had once been somebody's child, brother, wife, or sweetheart. Cindy Nettles had heard Oliver say that so many times that she could repeat it in her sleep. This morning, she stood in the embalming section of the mortuary, with her hands damp inside her gloves, while smoothing the lapel of her grandfather's dark suit jacket, one final time. Oliver lay on the stainless steel table, not because he would have wanted it, but because the funeral home had an ordinance and tradition and a strange reverence for practicality. His face had been carefully restored. His mouth was set in that mild, unreadable expression he wore when other people were making mistakes in front of him. He looked less like a corpse than a man pretending to sleep through an argument. Cindy stepped back and studied the arrangement. The tie was straight, the collar set clean against the shirt. A faint bruise on his temple that occurred when he collapsed and hit his head on the counter had been hidden with cosmetic work. His hands were folded over his chest. They looked pale and oddly small now, as if death had trimmed him down to essentials. Behind her, the prep room door swung open and shut. "You always did fuss like he might wake up and complain," said a voice. Cindy did not turn around right away. She knew that voice, the way some people knew a storm coming, by the pressure in their knees. It was her cousin, Duncan Nettles Osborne. He came into the room with his coat unbuttoned and his hands in his pockets. He looked polished in the way that a snake might look polished if someone managed to dress it in fine clothes. He was taller than Cindy by a couple of inches and built lean, with slick black hair and a face that could pass for handsome if you did not watch his eyes too closely. His expression carried a practiced sadness that never quite reached the corners of his mouth. "He's dead," Cindy said, "so I'm not sure he's in a position to complain." Duncan gave a low chuckle, as if she had said something affectionate. "He'd complain about the tie." "You would know," she grumbled. "You're the expert on what irritates him." That earned her a glance that was sharp and quick. Then the polite smile returned. Cindy looked back down at her grandfather as she said, "You should be outside." "I was outside," he informed her. "Aunt Lottie's crying again. Uncle Ray's pretending not to, and everyone keeps asking me if the service flowers are real." "Are they?" she asked. "Cindy," he snarled. She turned then and let him see the flatness in her face. "You came in here for a reason." "I came in here because you always lock yourself away before the family gathers." His gaze flickered over Oliver's body. "I thought maybe you'd want some help." She almost laughed at that. Duncan helping meant taking credit for work that he had not done and leaving the mess for someone else to clean up. He had learned the mortuary part of the trade under Oliver's sharp eye, the same as she had, but where Cindy had taken the lessons as a solemn duty, Duncan had treated them like a ladder with bloody rungs. He knew how to make a face peaceful. He knew how to conceal trauma, repair a blemish, and tuck a chin just so. He also knew which families paid extra not to ask where certain things went once the body was out of sight. Oliver had trusted him only in the broadest sense, enough to hand him tools, not enough to hand him keys. "Then help by staying out of my way," Cindy said. Duncan's smile tightened. "You still think you're the only one he relies on?" She shrugged. "I think he knew the difference between competence and charm." For a second, the room seemed to narrow around them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere deeper in the building, a refrigerator compressor kicked on with a low, mechanical hum. Then, Duncan's expression smoothed again. "You know, you'd look a lot prettier if you weren't always trying to sound like him." Cindy picked up the brush again and set it down with deliberate care. "And you'd sound a lot less like a coward if you ever said what you meant." "Careful," he warned. "Or what?" she boldly asked. His gaze held on her too long. It was icy cold under the surface. Then he smiled and stepped back towards the door. "Nothing," he said. "Today's not the day for family fights. Today's the day we bury the old man and smile for the neighbors." He left before she could answer. Cindy stood still after he was gone, while listening to the faint click of his shoes recede down the hallway. Only when the sound disappeared did she let herself breathe out. She looked again at Oliver's face. For a moment, only a moment, it seemed to her that his expression had changed. Not in any impossible way, nothing supernatural, just a peculiar trick of grief or exhaustion or the light shining through the narrow prep room window. His mouth looked firmer, more purposeful, and less at peace. Cindy reached out and smoothed the front of his jacket once more. "I'll make sure they do right by you," she murmured. By noon, the funeral home was full. The visitation room had been transformed into a landscape of lilies, folded hands, and expensive sadness. Black suits stood in clusters near the wall. Women dabbed at their eyes with tissues that were too white to be truly useful. Children had been told to whisper and were failing at it in the ways that children do with loud, accidental honesty. The air smelled of flowers over formaldehyde, over rain-soaked wool. Oliver's casket sat beneath the front window. It was polished and dark and surrounded by arrangements from 3 neighboring towns where a few people who had not seen him in 20 years but still believed they owed him their respect. His framed photograph stood on an easel nearby, showing him in his prime with his square shoulders, white shirt, and jaw that was set as if he'd been born already tired of nonsense. Sydney moved among the guests with practiced grace while accepting condolences, answering questions, and managing the endless small needs of mourning people who wanted to be comforted and left alone at the exact same time. "Your granddaddy was a fine man. He made me feel like my wife was in good hands. The world needs more men like Oliver Nettles." Cindy smiled when she had to, nodded when it was expected, and kept her hands folded so that no one would see the slight tremor in her fingers. The Nettles family had gathered in full. Her father sat near the back with his jaw clenched, looking older than he had 2 months ago. Her Aunt Alice wept into a lace handkerchief with theatrical devotion. Her cousin Reggie, Duncan's younger brother, kept checking his phone beneath the pew as if the dead might object if they caught him using it. And Duncan, immaculate in his dark suit, worked the room like a man born to inherit something that he did not deserve, while speaking softly to the mourners and accepting sympathy as though he was the one everyone had come to support. Cindy watched him from across the room and felt the old familiar warning in her gut. There were people she knew were wicked because of what they did, and people you knew were wicked because of how calm they remained while doing nothing at all. Duncan somehow managed both. When the service began, the room quieted. Reverend Hale, who had known Oliver since before he took over the running of the funeral home, took the lectern and spoke about legacy, service, and the strange mercy of a life lived in preparation for death. His voice rose and fell in the practiced cadence of a man who had buried too many people to still believe words could close every wound. Cindy listened without hearing much of it. She was thinking of her grandfather while he monitored her work, with one hand on a cabinet drawer as he told her to hold the jaw a little longer. She recalled the first time he had let her paint a bruised cheek to match the rest of the face, the cadence of his voice when he had said, "There's no dishonor in caring for the dead. Dishonor begins when you stop caring." She had believed him. The service ended in a procession to the family cemetery behind the house, where the Nettles plot lay under a stand of cedars with ironstone markers. The rain held off just long enough for the coffin to be lowered. The town's old resentment and newer respect stood shoulder to shoulder in the damp air as Oliver's family took turns tossing earth onto the polished lid. Duncan's handful was neat and restrained. Cindy's hit harder than she expected, with a clump of wet soil breaking apart as it fell. When it was over, the mourners drifted back towards the house for the reception. Food appeared in the dining room in a spread that was so large and unnecessary that it looked almost like a dare. Ham biscuits, deli meats with fresh loaves of rye bread from the bakery, egg salad, sliced fruit, deviled eggs, multiple casseroles from well-wishers, a tray of assorted cookies, and a cake so white and severe that it resembled a small monument. Coffee and tea, both hot and cold, were the beverages made ready on the side table. Cindy slipped away before the condolences could become conversation. She found herself on the back porch where the rain had begun again in a soft gray sheet across the yard. The graveyard was barely visible through the mist, and the markers were dark and still. Somewhere beyond the trees, one of the old estate homes sat with its curtains drawn and its lights already on. It was as if the family was bracing for night long before dusk. A shadow moved in the doorway behind her. When she turned to look, she noticed a handsome man who looked to be about her age and very familiar. He gave her a broad smile before asking, "Do you always hide on this porch after funerals?" Cindy studied him as recognition slowly set in. Andrew McWade stood with the moistness from the rain beating on his coat shoulders, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a black umbrella. He had not bothered to open. He was broader than she remembered, with a little more weight at the jaw and a steadier look in his eye, but his face was unmistakable. Andy. For a brief time, he had been her high school crush. They'd attended high school football games together, sat in the back row on movie dates, had one disastrous attempt at sex behind the old feed store, and then life had scattered them to opposite ends of the world. He looked at her for a long second, and the years seemed to step aside. "Andy," she said, with her voice softer than she meant it to be. His smile remained genuine. "Hi, Cindy." Something in her chest tightened and then eased. He glanced towards the house. "I didn't know whether to come. I didn't want to intrude." "You came," she smiled. He shrugged. "I couldn't stay away. I heard about your grandfather and felt I should pay my respects." "You knew him?" she asked. "Not really, but I knew what he meant to you," he replied. That landed gently. Cindy turned back towards the rain. She was suddenly aware of how tired she was and how long it had been since she had seen someone who made her feel like herself instead of the keeper of a house full of grief. Andy leaned against the porch post and studied her profile. "You look good." She snorted as she turned to look at him and said, "At a funeral?" "You know what I mean," he said with a grin. "I do not," she protested. "I look like somebody who hasn't slept in 3 days." "That too," he admitted. She smiled despite herself. He looked relieved by that, and for one suspended moment, the damp world around them felt less heavy. "I was going to ask," he said, "if maybe you'd have dinner with me sometime. Not today. I mean, today is a disaster, but maybe tomorrow, or whenever you're not buried under all of this." Cindy stared at him and then gave a quiet laugh that was more surprised than amused. "You're asking me out after standing in the rain at my grandfather's funeral." Trying to be respectful and persistent at the same time, he offered. Her face twisted in thought. "I'm not sure those go together." "They do, if you're committed enough," he continued. The answer came easier than she'd expected. "Dinner sounds nice." Something bright and boyish crossed his face, and for a second he looked exactly like he had at 17, full of confidence and just enough nervousness to make him human. "Good," he said. "Then it's a date." Cindy held his gaze a second longer than necessary. There was something about him that literally pulled at her, although she couldn't explain what that might be, and she was too tired to try to figure it out. Then, from inside the house, a glass clinked sharply against another. Voices swelled and receded, and the reception continued with all its living noise. Andy glanced over his shoulder. "Should probably get out of your way." "Probably," she said. "But I'm serious," he said as he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "Call me." He started to step away and then hesitated, as if there was more he wanted to say. Something unspoken passed over his face and then disappeared. He touched the brim of his own cap with a small, almost old-fashioned gesture and turned toward the yard. Cindy watched him go, with the rain beginning to blur him at the edges. When she finally went back inside, she felt, despite everything, an odd and fragile thread of hope pulling taut inside her. It was ill-advised to contemplate hope on a day like this. Hope made a person careless. Hope made you believe the world might pause long enough to let you grieve in peace. Cindy crossed the room, past the long tables of food and the low murmurs of the guests, and headed for the hall that led towards the rear of the funeral home. She needed a minute, needed air, needed the quiet of the workroom, where she could stand amongst the instruments and remind herself that the dead were easier to manage than the living. She had almost reached the prep room when she stopped. Light leaked beneath it, not the dim service lights that stayed on all the time, but bright fluorescent lights that were full of power. Cindy frowned. The mortuary section of the building should have been locked. Everyone who was supposed to be inside had been at the service. Her father was in the dining room. The staff had gone home after the burial. Even the security alarm indicator on the side entrance should have been armed. She stared at the thin line of light under the door. Then she heard it. A slow, careful, faint, metallic scrape. It was not the sound of a person cleaning up after a funeral. It was the sound of someone doing something they did not want discovered. Cindy reached for the knob and slowly opened the door, only to find the room empty. She scowled while checking things and closed the room up again.
I hope you enjoyed this sample of Once Upon a Morgue. To quote its 5-star award review by readers' favorite, it delivers a refreshing spin on the horror mystery genre that will keep you reading through the night. Once Upon a Morgue by Eileen Sheehan is available in ebook, print, and audio.